So it's 2021, and it's been like a year since coronavirus, and we're seeing a lot more traction in B2B e-commerce in terms of demand, which is essentially businesses trying to sell to other businesses online via e-commerce, more through like kind of like a self-serve model, whereas traditionally it was more, call up a manufacturer distributor and maybe order over the phone, or they might have sales reps that go meet you and try and get you to buy in person. Literally, like, that's actually a big part of B2B. And obviously a lot of that's moving online. And I think a lot of people don't realize how big that is. The e-commerce B2B market is bigger than actually the B2C market. And having done B2B e-commerce for, basically our entire existence as a company, like 10 years now, we've seen kind of every kind of problem, I guess, every kind of failure. So, I think it's just helpful for people to kind of hear it. Obviously we write blog posts and write a lot of content, but I think it's helpful to hear us explain it in a video. So hopefully this is helpful.
Right. Yeah. So Trellis's main focus was on consumer brands over the first few years, but as B2B becomes more prominent, we've been noticing a lot of problems with some of the clients over the years. So Isaiah, what have you been noticing, and how can?
Yeah, I think we started to get more and more into B2B e-commerce pretty early on. Like, even in our first few years, we were starting to do it, but it was still, we're still heavily B2C. But we started to kind of transition more into B2B over the years. And especially now it's like we kind of split it off. So we have like, almost look at it as like our B2B segment of the company and B2C. And sometimes we have hybrid. But what's interesting to us about B2B is it seems like they're quite a bit behind, like I would say from an e-commerce educational standpoint. And actually one of our newest podcasts that'll be coming out soon is with a guy in Australia. And he talks about this. He's kind of like a leader in Australia in B2B e-commerce. And he's saying the number one problem is actually education, which I don't even know if I put that on the blog post. Might have to update it, but basically like education is the number one problem from his perspective. And it's, they're really like 5-10 years behind in terms of staff and expertise and education around e-commerce. And it's also just more complicated, right? So B2C, right. You could typically just do like a Shopify website. Not always. I mean, that's not always the case, but typically you can do kind of like a simpler website, use something like Shopify and get up and running fairly quickly, at least, basic B2C. And B2B, it's just a lot more difficult to do that. It's very difficult to have a basic B2B site because what typically you need from a basic level is more complicated. You have a larger catalog of products usually. So that's like the first problem we see is
more moving parts.
Yeah, they might have 40,000 products and they're used to it being in the ERP system. So it's like, SKU size, like a couple like data points that are for like transactions. And if someone calls you over the phone, you're like, oh yeah, we got this in stock. But like when you look on a website, you're expecting like a lot more like consumer friendly, information that they don't even have in a way that's set up for these e-commerce platforms. So it's all in their ERP system. Usually it's only like, 30% of the data that they should have for e-commerce. So then they have to go kind of figure out how to get all the data up to date for e-commerce. And it's like a monumental task. I'm talking about like 40,000. I'm just using 40,000 example. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. But it's a lot of data. And if you don't even understand how the e-commerce platforms work, that's also a hurdle. So I think that's just like one small example of the problems that we encounter. It's probably the most common because it's like very simple problem, but takes a lot of time to solve. And then there's just so many other problems. And I almost think that's a better way to sum it up is like, if I think in this post, I wrote like 10 problems and there's probably another like 5 or 10 that I could have listed, but these are some of the more common ones. And it's like, if you don't get all of those right, it's really hard to be successful, right? And generally you're going to have at least 2 or 3 of those problems. And so, I think that's the problem is when you're not experienced with this and there's, 10 or 15 important things that you have to get right, like product data, having a good e-commerce manager, having the real-time ERP data around pricing and having alignment with your sales team, like all these things have to go kind of hand in hand. you're probably going to mess up one of those things, you know.
Right.
And I think part of the other issue is that you can't necessarily just hire an agency to do a project to solve these problems. And that's kind of why I wrote this post, right? Because a lot of people hire us, we can do the technical project, but like, you know, we can't exactly figure out all your operations per se, because some of that has to come from you. Like, you run the business, you know, you fulfill the products. Like, we don't control the way that you ship out products and price your products. And
Right.
there's a lot that the agency, like a Trellis or any other agency, can't do. So that's where I think that there's a big falling down, is kind of like, oh, let's just hire this company and we'll build a site. But a lot of the problems go way beyond what an agency can solve, or a traditional, you know, e-commerce agency like a Trellis can solve.
And that's why the relationship between agency and client is so important. You know, communication needs to be on both sides, and that's how these companies are able to grow. If it was
Yeah,
easy, everyone would be doing it, right?
yeah, I think that's a, yeah, I think it's I think what needs to change is a more of like a transparent partnership, you know, aspect of things. I think, you know, when we're able to talk to the companies and tell them like, hey, here's where we think you're struggling or where your problems are, and they listen to us, and their problems that they have to go solve themselves, those seem to go a lot better, because they're like, oh yeah, you're right, like, you know, we need to go do this, we need, you know, we had one that they have issues with product data, and they admitted that, and they're willing to go fix it, and kind of like, you know, we'll help them where we can help them, but they know that like there's a certain point where it's like kind of more on them and not on us, you know. But the willingness to kind of like listen to, you know, the other partner that maybe has more expertise and figure out where the problems are and who needs to solve them, I think is the key. And that's, yeah, right, it's all communication. But I think that the problem is that there's kind of like a misaligned expectation, or, you know, I think that the expectation is, oh, you know, we have this budget and it's going to kind of just like get everything done for us, you know. And I think that's where it kind of goes off the rails, because typically what you expect is more than what's reality in this industry. And
So
then,
would you say B2B brands are generally misconstrued when they come into the project expectations? Are they expecting too much?
yeah, I would say they're expecting too much. I think they don't really understand how much it takes to build a good B2B e-commerce site, from, you know, both internal work, you know, the internal side of what they need to do, and then what the agency needs to do, and what money gets you, right? Like 100,000, let's say, gets you roughly X. It's like a house, right? Like, if you want to buy a house for $100,000, generally you're going to get relatively the same things, you know. Maybe you can find a slightly cheaper construction company, or, you know what I mean? But like, generally a door is going to cost a door. And that's similar in software development to some degree. And I think that because there's just a lack of expertise coming from these companies and experience, they expect a little bit more than what they're going to get. And so they're kind of like generally unsatisfied. And then they jump around from agency to agency thinking that's going to solve the problem, when
Right.
that's not really going to solve the problem, you know?
And that's what happens with a new industry like e-commerce. E-commerce in general is a new frontier. Everyone is still trying to learn how to operate efficiently in
Yeah,
this space.
I agree.
Especially when it comes to B2B, it's even less known. So bridging that knowledge gap is the first step.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. And I think B2C is a little bit ahead. So we're kind of seeing a little bit more maturity in the market, where companies that have been around for a little while, they've already had an e-commerce site for 5, 10 years, and, you know, they've got some traction, and they kind of like have some idea of what to do to get to the next level. And I think with most B2B companies, they don't really have a very good strategic roadmap or much experience with the modern platforms, like, you know, like a Magento or Shopify or BigCommerce, or some of the, you know, kind of well-known platforms. So they might have something, but it might be something really legacy. And that thing is so almost like obsolete compared to what exists today. So it's like, you don't really know what to expect from like the modern systems that you kind of need today. Yeah, honestly, we could probably spend hours talking about this, but I think this is a good summary. Hopefully this added some value to just the text that we wrote, which is why we're doing these videos. So we'll keep doing them, and please leave comments, because we want to know how to help people more.
Definitely. Please reach out with any questions. Thanks.